In March 1945, during the final days of the siege of Berlin, Anton Weiss, a 19-year-old German soldier, finds himself trapped in an abandoned bunker after his unit is decimated by a Soviet bombardment. What should have been temporary shelter becomes an underground prison when debris blocks the only exit. Alone in near-total darkness, with only a broken flashlight and limited ammunition, Anton must face not only growing hunger and despair, but also the ghostly voices echoing through the corridors: dead soldiers, lost civilians, and memories of his sister Greta, who promised to wait for his return home to Dresden. Among starving rats, rusted cans, and remnants of interrupted lives, Anton will discover that the line between survival and humanity is thinner than he ever imagined. Each day underground forces him to make decisions that will leave scars deeper than any war wound, and when he finally emerges to the surface, he will carry secrets he can never share with the living. The taste of iron never left my mouth. Even now, 7 decades later, when I chew a piece of fresh bread in the kitchen of my apartment in Sao Paulo, I still feel that metallic taste spreading across my tongue. People think it's because of age, medications, the poorly fitted denture. But I know the truth. I know exactly when that taste arrived and why it decided to stay forever. It was in March 1945, when I learned that hunger is capable of transforming any man into something he never imagined he could become. I was 19 years old and weighed 92 pounds when I finally emerged from that bunker. When I entered it, 3 weeks earlier, I still carried the last remnants of the boy who grew up playing in the wheat fields around Dresden. When I came out, I carried something very different in my eyes, something that my sister Greta noticed immediately, even in the midst of the chaos of those final days of war. "Where have you been, Anton?" she asked, touching my face with trembling fingers. "What happened to you?" I could never answer. How do you explain that you spent 21 days buried alive, counting the seconds between each drop of water falling from the cracked ceiling? How do you tell someone that you fought for territory with rats the size of cats, that you found things in the rubble that no human being should find, that you made choices that would haunt you forever? The bunker wasn't on any official map. It was an improvised construction, hastily dug during the winter of 1944, when we still believed Berlin would resist. 11.5 feet below street level, with poorly cured concrete walls and a ventilation system that seemed more like a cruel joke. It was supposed to shelter 15 people for a maximum of 48 hours. In March 1945, when the Russians were less than 100 meters from our position, it became my home, my prison, and almost my tomb. I was with 3 other soldiers when the bombs started falling. Klaus, a 22-year-old Bavarian who always carried a photo of his fiancée in his shirt pocket. Werner, a Stalingrad veteran with a scar that cut across his face from his left ear to his chin. And Dieter, only 17 years old, who still called for his mother when the shells passed too close. The first explosion cracked the concrete above our heads. The second brought down half the ceiling. The third, the closest one, made the world literally collapse on top of us. When the dust settled and the ringing in my ears diminished enough for me to think clearly, I realized 3 things. First, I was alive. Second, my left leg was trapped under an iron beam. Third, I was completely alone. Klaus, Werner, and Dieter had simply disappeared. In the place where they had been, only rubble and a dark pool that I preferred not to identify. The bunker entrance, our only exit, was blocked by tons of concrete and twisted iron. Above me, through a tiny crack in the structure, I could see a small piece of gray sky. So close I could touch it if my arm were 8 inches longer. As distant as the moon. The first 3 days were the easiest. I still had hope. I still believed someone would come looking for me, that the screams I gave every hour would eventually be heard. I had a military canteen almost full, some preserves I found scattered on the floor, and my flashlight worked perfectly. I rationed everything with military discipline. 1 sip of water every 2 hours. Half a can of preserves per day. I kept the flashlight on only long enough to check my wounds or search for an alternative exit. I talked to myself to keep from going insane, repeating conversations I had with Greta, reciting poems we had learned in school, telling stories my grandfather used to tell me about the First World War. It was on the 4th day that I heard the first rat. It wasn't the sound of it running, it was the sound of it eating something. A wet, persistent sound that came from somewhere among the rubble to my left. I turned on the flashlight and saw a creature the size of a house cat, with matted fur and eyes that reflected the light like small mirrors. It was devouring something I couldn't identify and didn't want to identify. When the light hit it, it didn't flee. It just raised its head, looked at me for a few seconds as if evaluating whether I posed any threat, and went back to eating. In that moment, a part of me understood that the rules had changed. On the 5th day, my water ran out. The crack in the ceiling gave me a few drops when it rained, but March had been particularly dry. I sucked on pieces of wet concrete, licked the walls where moisture condensed, drank my own urine, first with disgust, then with gratitude, finally with the naturalness of someone drinking tap water. On the 7th day, my preserves ran out. On the 8th day, I began to observe the rats with different eyes. There were at least a dozen of them living among the rubble. They had established a small underground society, with well-defined territories and a clear hierarchy. The largest of them, whom I came to call Kaiser, controlled the area near what had been the bunker entrance. The others distributed themselves around the corners, each guarding their small treasure of scraps and remains. They ignored me most of the time. I had become part of the landscape, just another piece of wreckage among so many others. But I watched them. I learned their schedules, their habits, their weak points. I discovered they went out to forage always at the same time, right after the daylight completely disappeared from the crack in the ceiling. On the 9th day, I built my first trap. I used the string for my military identification, a sharp piece of metal I broke off from a beam, and as bait, one of the buttons for my uniform. It didn't work. The rats were smarter than I had imagined. They smelled the trap, examined it from all angles, and simply went around it. On the 10th day, I changed strategy. Instead of trying to capture them, I decided to follow them. I discovered they had a food source I hadn't found, a pile of sugar sacks that had been buried in one of the explosions. The sacks were torn, the sugar had spilled and hardened with moisture, but it was still food. The rats gnawed the hard chunks, transported pieces to their nests, made small stockpiles. I waited for them to finish their nightly activities. Then, in complete darkness, because my flashlight had finally died on the 8th day, I crawled to where they had been. I felt the floor with my hands until I found the pieces of sugar they had dropped. The first piece I put in my mouth tasted of earth, dust, and something else I preferred not to identify. But it was sweet. It was energy. It was life. I cried while I ate. On the 11th day, the rats and I established a kind of truce. They allowed me to collect their leftovers, and I didn't interfere with their main activities. We even came to share the same water source, the drops that fell from the ceiling into a small hole they had dug in the ground. But the sugar wouldn't last forever. And the rats, I noticed, were getting fatter while I continued to waste away. On the 12th day, I made the first discovery that would change everything. I was exploring an area of the bunker I had avoided until then, the back, where the darkness was denser and the smell stronger. My hand touched something soft, warm. For an instant, my heart raced thinking I had found another survivor. But when I investigated further, I discovered it was just a rat's nest. A nest full of newborn pups. They were small, pink, blind. Completely helpless. The mother wasn't around. She had probably gone out foraging. I held them in my hands, feeling their little hearts beating against my fingers. And then a voice in my head, a voice that wasn't entirely mine, whispered, "Fresh protein." I dropped the pups as if they were on fire. I moved away from the nest, pressed against the farthest wall, and tried to forget what I had thought. But hunger is a primitive force, prior to morality, prior to civilization. It speaks a language that the body understands before the mind, and it was screaming louder and louder inside me. On the 13th day, I returned to the nest. The mother was there, nursing the pups. When she saw me, she positioned herself defensively, showing her teeth. We stared at each other for several minutes, two hungry creatures protecting what was theirs. I backed away. I wasn't ready yet. But on the 14th day, I was. The technique was simpler than I had imagined. I waited for the mother to leave, blocked the nest entrance with stones, and simply took one of the pups. The smallest one. I told myself it probably wouldn't survive anyway. Killing it was harder than eating it. Killing required a conscious decision. Eating was just instinct. The taste was indescribable. It wasn't good, but it also wasn't as bad as I had imagined. It was meat. It was survival. It was the difference between living and dying. That night, for the first time in 2 weeks, I slept without the pain of hunger gnawing at my stomach. On the 15th day, I realized I had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The rats now saw me as a predator. They changed their patterns, avoided the areas where I stayed, posted sentries when they went out foraging. Kaiser, the leader, watched me constantly, as if trying to decide whether I represented a threat worth confronting. But I had tasted protein, and my body demanded more. On the 16th day, I set up a real ambush. I used stones to create a narrow corridor, forcing the rats to pass through a specific point where I could catch them. It worked. I captured an adult, not Kaiser, but one of his subordinates. It was a harder death than the pups. It fought, scratched me, screamed in a way I didn't know rats could scream. But I was beyond scruples. Hunger had burned away everything in me that wasn't essential for survival. From the 17th to the 20th day, I became an efficient hunter. I learned that rats were most vulnerable right after eating, when they became slow and sluggish. I discovered they were afraid of loud, sudden noises, which I could use to direct them where I wanted. I developed slaughter techniques that minimize suffering, not out of compassion, but because stressed animals become tougher and taste worse. I became part of the bunker's ecology. Predator and prey at the same time, because I knew that if I got injured or sick, the rats wouldn't hesitate to devour me too. On the 21st day, I made the second discovery. I was exploring a new area, digging among the rubble looking for more nests, when my hand touched something that clearly wasn't concrete or metal. It was fabric. I pulled, and a piece of military uniform emerged. German. I dug more and found an arm. Then another arm. Then a torso. It was Klaus. Or what was left of him. The rats had found the body before me and had been working on it for days, transforming my comrade in arms into their private meat depot. The smell was unbearable. The sight was worse. But what hit me like a punch to the stomach was realizing that I envied the rats. In that moment, looking at Klaus's remains, a part of me calculated how many days of food that represented. A part of me considered disputing that territory with the rodents. A part of me remembered the taste of fresh protein. I staggered away, found a corner where I could be alone, and vomited everything that was in my stomach. Which wasn't much. Then I cried until I had no more tears. And then when there was nothing left to come out of me, I just sat in the dark and accepted what I had become. On the 22nd day, I heard voices. At first I thought they were hallucinations, my mind finally giving in to isolation and malnutrition. But the voices got louder, clearer. They were Russian soldiers, searching for survivors among the rubble above the bunker. I screamed until my voice disappeared. I banged stones against the walls until my fingers bled. I made all the noise I could. And finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard a voice responding from the other side of the rubble.
Есть кто-то живой там.
I didn't speak Russian, but the intonation was universal. It was the question I had been waiting to hear for 3 weeks. Is anyone alive in there? It took them 6 hours to get me out. 6 hours of careful work, removing stone by stone, beam by beam, until they opened a hole big enough for me to pass through. When I finally emerged to the surface, daylight blinded me completely. I had forgotten what the world looked like with colors. The Russian soldier who pulled me out was young, maybe my age. He looked at me, my 92 pounds, my tangled beard, my sunken eyes, and said something in Russian that sounded like compassion. Then he gave me a piece of black bread and a sip of vodka. The bread tasted like paradise. The vodka burned my throat in a wonderful way. But when I tried to swallow, my stomach rebelled. I had spent so long eating other things that my body had forgotten how to process normal food. They took me to a field hospital, where a German doctor who was collaborating with the Russians examined me. He noted my condition on a clipboard: severe malnutrition, possible psychological trauma, need for gradual food rehabilitation. "What did you eat during those 3 weeks?" he asked in German, with the clinical curiosity of someone who had seen many similar cases. I could have told the truth. I could have explained about the hardened sugar, about the nests, about the hunting techniques I developed. I could have described the taste, the texture, the gradual evolution from disgust to acceptance to something that bordered on pleasure. Instead, I said, I found some preserves. It didn't last long, but it was enough. He wrote that down on the clipboard and moved on to the next patient. 2 weeks later, I was strong enough to travel. The Russians had a repatriation program for cooperative German prisoners, and I qualified. A train journey through a destroyed Germany to Dresden, where Greta was waiting for me in a refugee camp. She had lost weight too. Everyone had lost weight in those final months of the war. But when she saw me getting off the train, Her expression changed to something between relief and horror. "Anton," she whispered, hugging me. "My God, what did they do to you?" I could have told her about the bunker, about the loneliness, about the 21 days of darkness. I could have described the sound of water dripping, the cold that penetrated to the bones, the constant fear that the rubble would come down completely. Instead, I said, "Nothing that can't be healed with time." But she tasted the iron in my kiss. And that night, when she prepared a potato stew, our first family meal in over a year, she saw me chew slowly, analyzing each texture, each flavor, as if my brain was comparing everything to another reference standard. "Did you eat well while you were away?" she asked, perhaps sensing there was something wrong with how I related to food. "I ate what was available," I replied. And that was the closest to the truth I could tell. Today, at 91 years old, I still dream about that bunker. I wake up sometimes in the middle of the night thinking I'm back there, groping in the dark, hearing the sound of rats running among the rubble. The taste of iron continues in my mouth, and sometimes, when I'm very tired or very stressed, I catch myself calculating how many calories there are in things that a normal person would never consider food. Greta died 10 years ago, taking with her all the questions she never asked and all the answers I never gave. My children know I was a soldier, that I survived the war, that I came to Brazil in 1952 looking for a new beginning. They know I don't like to talk about those times, and they respect my silence. What they don't know, what nobody knows, is that sometimes when I pass by some dark alley in Sao Paulo, or when I hear construction noises that remind me of rubble being removed, a part of me goes back to March 1945. A part of me never left that bunker. And in those moments, I understand that the line between civilization and barbarism is much thinner than anyone would like to admit. That anyone, under enough pressure, is capable of things they never imagined. That hunger is a force more primitive than love, more powerful than morality, more lasting than memory. 21 days. That's all it took for me to discover who I really was underneath all the education, all the culture, all the values I thought defined me. 21 days to learn that, in the end, we are all just animals trying to survive. And sometimes, late at night, when the apartment is silent and the city sleeps outside, I can still hear the rats running in the walls.